Giving up. It's how many a match has concluded, signified with a fluttering of the hand known as tapping out. But it didn't always used to be this way, and perhaps those times were better. So, should we give up on giving up, and how did all this start to begin with? Well, that's the subject of this episode, because today... Okay, so today we're going to be looking at three main issues when it comes to the subject of tapping out. We're going to be looking at how all this got started, we're also going to be looking at what changed as a result, and we're also going to be looking at whether or not this was a good thing that we have it at all. Alright, so first, how did all this happen? Well, the act of tapping out to represent having had enough all began a long time ago in martial arts, such as jiu-jitsu, and especially when it came to training. Now, for those of you who are uninitiated, jiu-jitsu is a ground-based martial art designed for close quarters combat, with a lot of similarities to wrestling. And just like with wrestling, you can win a match in jiu-jitsu via submission. Okay, fine, I get that, but why tapping of all things? Well, tapping out gives a much clearer sign that you've yielded. Sure, you could verbally submit, but if you're in a headlock or something, you may not be able to fully shout if you have your opponent's arm covering your mouth, or if you're just too gassed to speak.
Third rule of Fight Club. Someone yells stop, goes limp, taps out. The fight is over.
So, the tapping sound on the mat can cue an audio signal when speech is not available. Furthermore, the practice of tapping directly on your opponent does an even better job because your opponent can actually feel it, instantly letting them know that you've submitted. This is especially helpful for sparring and training, where it isn't about winning, but merely experiencing combat for learning purposes. So, by tapping during training or sparring, it lets the other person know that you got the message and that we can move on and learn another hold. Now, of course, this was done in active competition as well, migrating with the evolution of martial arts to modern-day mixed martial arts, as jiu-jitsu birthed Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and we first got the term MMA in 1993. But when exactly did all this land in professional wrestling? Well, that's a different story, one that we're gonna have to wait just a little bit to get to. For now, let's focus on what changed as a result of the tap gaining popularity, because I say, we were better off without it. Let's go back to a simpler time. In the good old days, like with one of my absolute favorite matches of all time, Bret Hart vs. Mr. Perfect at SummerSlam 1991 for the Intercontinental title, Bret won the championship via submission with the famous sharpshooter. But you'll notice and might be surprised to see that Mr. Perfect never taps out. He simply just shakes his head, and the ref almost immediately calls for the bell. Now, what exactly happened here in kayfabe is anyone's guess. Perhaps Perfect verbally submitted and was shouting, "No, I don't wish to continue!" Or perhaps he was just selling the pain, and the ref called for the bell as the hold was locked in. Which might sound surprising to some of you who aren't familiar with some of the forms of shoot wrestling out there. When the grappling is legit, remember, it's all about securing holds. The idea of wrestling is trying to catch your opponent with a hold to gain victory before they do the same to you, and in which case, some forms allow for a win to be cleared once a hold is deemed locked in, where escape is not feasible. And this is just one authentic aspect that's missing from today's pro wrestling, with many promotions looking to be a worked version of MMA instead of being a worked version of actual wrestling. But look, I get it. After MMA gained popularity, professional wrestling promotions had to react quickly, as some panicked seeing a shoot version of what they had always been doing as a work, fearing that it would ruin the industry. Thus, some companies like WWE began incorporating aspects of MMA into the fold, while others went in the complete opposite direction, foolishly trying to turn professional wrestling into a legitimate form of competitive combat. And I've already done an episode on that, which you can no longer watch, thanks to that stupid company that we're not allowed to talk about anymore. But if you have a problem with that, I highly encourage you to take it up with them. Back to the lecture at hand. I'm sure some of you are thinking to yourselves, so what's the harm in any of this? Even if WWE is copying a few aspects from the UFC, it's not like it's a big deal, it's not like it's a problem or anything, right? Well, unfortunately, I say it is. And going back to the sharpshooter, I feel that a move like that is the biggest victim of this change. If simply securing the move was all you needed to score a win, it would improve the entire concept, because waiting for a tap has been over-milked these days to create a whole bunch of drama. For example, we see wrestlers crawling across the ring to get to the ropes over and over again while in the sharpshooter, making the move look so much less effective as a result. However, whenever wrestling sees a chance for drama and suspense, it's going to take it. It's just what wrestling does. And yes, I am aware that finisher spamming and the watering down of big moves is rampant in today's professional wrestling, but that's not the point. The point is, it's just another excuse for wrestling to do what it does, and we don't need to be giving wrestling any more excuses. Furthermore, if a submission can be deemed by a referee, it helps the victim save face, as a tap-out surrender is viewed as a statement of weakness, with some wrestlers even making it a point of pride for how they've never tapped, and it's become much more difficult character-wise for babyfaces to tap out in a post-John Cena never give up world. Think about it. Heroes almost never tap out anymore. It's somehow become rarer than a heel getting a clean victory. Go figure that one out. But if we just eliminate the whole tapping thing, a babyface could better save face while still looking strong in the feet. Going back to the way things used to be, wrestlers did also verbally submit too, but it just wasn't a big deal, nor was it as clear and distinct as tapping out. Like here, Flair is nodding his head, where if you remember, Perfect was shaking his. Now, the difference between nodding or shaking one's head versus tapping out might seem minor, but I do think that it makes a big difference, mostly because the act of tapping out has become too much of a focal point, and also because a verbal submission is less obvious to the crowd. Although, you could make it obvious too on occasion if you're really trying to get someone over. It's really all about options. Okay, so now that we covered all that, let's finally get into where it all started for pro wrestling. Now, when it comes to this question, some of you might be quick to answer and say that it was Ken Shamrock who started all this when he debuted in the WWF as a wrestler in 1997, simply carrying it over from his UFC days. However, there is a bit of a problem with that statement. Now, Shamrock himself even took to Twitter and said, "Before I entered WWF, tapping out was not a thing. After I joined, tapping out became a big thing. Fact." However, while he definitely popularized it, was he really the first one to do it? Well, there is one wrestler who might have something to say about that. And that wrestler is Taz. As the Human Suplex Machine responded to this tweet by saying, regarding WWF, you are correct. Not sure who started doing it in wrestling first, you or I, but it was close to the same time, I think. Hope you are well, man." Ken Shamrock responded back by saying, "Just speaking on WWF, I know you did your thing and I loved it. Stay strong, my friend." A mutual admiration on both parts. But this does beg the question, who really did start doing it first? As Shamrock was definitely collecting taps with the ankle lock, and Taz was definitely getting the sound of one hand clapping with the Tazmission at around the same time. Well, to answer this, let's go over the facts. We already established that Ken started making people tap in the WWF in 1997, but Taz had already been wrestling for 10 years by that point. However, there are some interesting notes on this. Now, both men seem to be in agreement that Ken Shamrock is the one who started in WWF. But there might actually be someone who did it first, and that person is, surprisingly, Taz. Back in February 1997, Taz defeated Mikey Whipwreck via submission during an ECW Invasion match on Monday Night Raw, and as you can see, Mikey's hand is flapping something awful. But this is happening in mid-air and not on Taz himself, so this could just be convulsion selling or it may be a tap. Just remember, as I said earlier, a tap doesn't necessarily have to be on a person. So whether this counts as an official tap or not, well, I'll just leave that up to you. Oh, but I do have to mention, you know who was live in attendance for this very match? Well, it was none other than Ken Shamrock, who was appearing as a special guest that night. Strange coincidence, huh? But regardless as to where you stand on this particular tap, Taz does have other ones to consider, like this one in ECW, where he got the win over Koji Nakagawa, who came from Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, a company that might be better known for its ultra-violence, but remember, it does have martial arts right in its name, which, as I mentioned earlier, is where the roots of tapping out all began, making this yet another example of the seller deserving more credit for really getting something over. Now, when did this tap out occur? Well, it happened on December 29th, 1995, predating Ken Shamrock's WWF debut. Or does it? As Ken Shamrock really had his first match in the WWF back in 1989. as a jobber. He wouldn't return to the company again for another 8 years, but in between, he didn't shy away from pro wrestling either. He just did it overseas, wrestling in Japan, which is where Nakagawa's from. Also, jiu-jitsu, and that's how this whole conversation got started in the first place. The reality is that tapping out is just as old as time, and in professional wrestling, it may have become popular in WWF thanks to Ken Shamrock, but it was first done outside of WWE by wrestlers like Taz, who are already doing it in ECW, to wrestlers like Koji Nakagawa, who brought it with them from Japan, where the tradition seems to have all started in the first place. And hey, if you want more information about that and more visuals, well, I would, but you know. Anyway, there you go, the history of tapping out in professional wrestling and why it's not necessarily a good thing. What do you think? What are some of your earliest tap out moments that you can remember? Let me know down in the comments. And don't forget to make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and that you give this video a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all of my awesome Patreon supporters. And as always, Dave knows.